When soldiers were out in rest billets, perhaps in an old French barn behind the lines, they sat around in groups, delousing their uniforms. This process was called chatting. They spoke to each other. They recounted the stories of their last time in the trenches or news from home. They chatted. It was a chat, and this bit of verbal currency is still in use by us today. So welcome to our first trench chat on the Old Front Line. I'm joined for our first Old Front Line chats by Battlefield Guide Tim Thurlow. I've known Tim for many years, and for the past few years we've worked together on Ledger Battlefield tours. Tim, where did your interest in the Great War start? You've been visiting the battlefields for some time now, haven't you?
Yeah, I think like you, certainly my first visit to the Somme was 1985. And again, probably like many people my generation, really, it was just something we grew up. The veterans were everywhere. If you switched on the telly, it was war films, comics were all aimed at war stories, Victor, that sort of thing. So it was just all around me. And I had the opportunity to visit the battlefields in 1985, and I've had the hook ever since.
So for all those years, it was a hobby, but now it's part of the job that you do. You work as a guide.
For many years it was just going over to France, the battlefields of the First World War with my brother. But an opportunity arose 2017, I think it was my first season with Ledger, and it's been a really good 3 years.
And what do you get out of guiding when you're with a group?
Well, knowledge isn't ours. It's sharing my passion. It's taking people to the battlefields, whether it's to see their relatives or just out of general interest. But it's really just sort of sharing the knowledge, telling the stories of the soldiers, making them live again, and helping people connect with the past, their relatives who have fallen or fought on the battlefields. That's the most important part.
And more than a century later, we still find, don't we, that people really do connect with this, that it's a distant relative that they may only have a faded photograph of, but it's real to them.
It certainly is. And when you take them to the grave of their fallen soldier, it's raw emotion. 100 years just melts away. And somebody that perhaps they never knew, it was just somebody that Granny told them about, they become very, very emotional. And it's really moving to see that. The ripples are still connecting from 1914-18 all the way through to the present day.
And it is those personal stories that people like when they're on a trip to the battlefields. They want to bring those silent cities alive, don't they, with the stories of the men that are there.
They're the most important part of the whole thing, bringing them back, making them live again, telling their stories, connecting with the past.
And walking the battlefields is an excellent way to really understand the Great War, perhaps the best way.
In my opinion, yes. Boots on the ground, as they say. You touch the landscape, you see every little fold, little rise in the ground, a little hollow. You start to interpret sort of a shallow bank where the wounded would shelter from machine gun fire or artillery. And for me, that is one of the most rewarding aspects of visiting the battlefields, is just becoming part of that landscape and understanding what happened there in 1418.
And we can read endless books on this, but once we're on the ground, I think it's when those books and when the landscape comes alive, isn't it?
Yeah, books are absolutely vital, and you spend sort of the winter months reading, and then as soon as the weather improves and you can get out onto the battlefields, or even in all four seasons weather, walking and actually visiting them, understanding the landscapes, being there, it's a powerful thing.
And aside from walks on the battlefields that you do, on our tours, you go yourself quite a lot, don't you? Right off the beaten track.
Yeah, that's the beauty of independent travel. You can park your car at your gîte or wherever, put your boots, rucksack, bottle of water, a sandwich, and just get out onto those tracks, the lanes that crisscross the farmers' fields into the woods. You don't return to the car until sort of 5-6 p.m. in the evening, having left it at 9:30.
And how do you choose the places that you go to walk when you're on those visits?
One I feel most connected to is the Somme. If I've done a lot of reading, for example, around the fighting around Pozières, you just follow the tracks. I usually go in the winter when I do most of my walking. The fields are bare of crops. And within reason, the farmers don't mind you sort of cutting across a ploughed field as long as you respect the crops, and you can just go wherever you want to. Sometimes I don't even have a plan.
And do you take what, trench maps or linesman or something like that with you?
Yeah, the early days it was paper maps, a linesman, the computer program with the trench maps, GPS overlay. You can find out exactly, almost to a few meters, where you are in sort of comparison to an old trench map from 1916.
And when you're right out in some of those quite out of the way locations that you go to when you go walking, you find stuff, don't you?
Well, it's not always in the out of the way locations. I don't go looking for stuff. I don't sort of put on a pair of super powerful glasses and walk looking for something. If I've read up on a particular area and I go to the front line where, for example, the Notts and Derby went over at Gomcourt, which was purely by chance that I was stood there, and I said to my brother, this is where the 1st, 5th Notts and Derby were. This was where the German front wire was. This is where so many of them got cut to pieces. And I looked down at my feet, and there in the mud was a Notts and Derby cap badge, and it had to be the 1st to 5th Notts and Derby.
And these objects, they connect us to the past. What does it mean to you when you find something like that?
Well, let me tell you about the very first piece of personal item I found, for want of a way of saying. It was a shoulder title to a Manchester City battalion man just below the village of Montalban. And I'd kind of gone walking there because I was following the 30th and 18th divisions. And I saw this oval. It's a very distinct badge. And your eye just picks up something slightly different in the soil. And I knew immediately what it was. But when I picked it up, it was like an electric shock going through my body. Really felt as if I was connecting with that individual. It's difficult to explain. It really is difficult, but it's a tangible reminder of a life lost or a soldier wounded and time melted away. Very, very powerful.
Tell us about some of the things that you found, because it's not just badges and shoulder titles. It's a whole variety of things that you've just chanced across as you walk these fields.
Yeah, perhaps one of the most poignant items, and it was just near Orvilla's British Cemetery, was a gleam of silver in a clump of soil, and picked it up, didn't know what it was. It was a silver tube. Rubbed the mud off, washed it with a bit of water, and inscribed on it was "From Uxbridge, January 1916." And then on closer examination, inside the tube was a propelling pencil, and you could still see the point of the pencil where it had been sharpened. You could see the rubber on top, the erasure. And I just thought, what was written with this? Was it a last letter home to mum and dad, or to a sweetheart? Or was it a little field note saying, we're cut off, send more small arms ammunition? That's possibly one of the most powerful. And of course, as you're well aware, the grave markers from Courcelette.
Yeah, so at Courcelette, you found quite a few of the aluminium strips from the original crosses.
Yeah, it was a story of 2 or 3 years, really, because the track that runs up to the cemetery from the village, I'd find tiny little fragments of aluminium with a number or a letter on, and I knew what they were, but they were just so small and fragmented that, you couldn't take anything from them. And then one year, there just seemed 1 or 2 extra pieces, and I sort of followed the track just past the cemetery, and there, in a clump of mud, caught my eye was a mass of these aluminium tags, all twisted, a lot of corrosion on them, covered in soil. But it was like a fistful, and I would say probably 30 or 40 almost complete, or certainly enough of them to know who they were. And then a lot of detective work afterwards with the partial ones. I've probably got 60 or 70 soldiers that I've now been able to visit, and in some cases off the internet actually got images of them there, particularly the Canadians. A really powerful find. And the good story for that is I was recently contacted by somebody in Canada, and quite randomly, this is through the power of social media. He said, I don't suppose you've got a fragment of my relative. And all he gave me was a 5 or 6 digit number. And I spent 1 hour or so in this lockdown world that we live in the sunny garden, as it was, a nice afternoon. And I had his relative's grave marker, or a part of it. And as soon as normal postage resumes, that fragment is going back to Canada, where it will become one of the family's most treasured possessions.
Wow, incredible! That's just incredible. And these are from the wooden crosses that were gathered in when the cemeteries were made permanent. Some people requested them to be sent home, but majority of them were piled up and burned, and that's how I guess that pile came about.
Yeah, well, I think it was talking to your daughter Poppy, and through the story that Yves Foucault, a chap that both of us know and a very good friend of yours, he recalls actually burning the crosses at the location that I found this bundle of twisted metal. Most of them had come from Regina Trench Cemetery, which is a good mile and a half from actual Courcelette. So I can imagine the crosses being brought down, stripped of their aluminium or just chucked into a pit, a bit of fuel, and just burnt. You know, they were being replaced with the stones that we're also familiar with now, and nobody claimed these wooden crosses. What do you do with them?
And Regina Trench is such an isolated cemetery, isn't it? You can see the sense of them having somewhere a little bit nearer to a semi-main road at that time to bring the things to and decide what to do with them all in one place.
Yeah, I don't know quite why they didn't burn them closer to Regina Trench. I don't know. But in that mass, there was two Australians, and they're both actually in Courcelette, literally over the wall from where the crosses, the tags were found. And to be able to put that original piece of aluminium, Charles Tipper, on his grave, take a photograph, and incredibly moving. Time disappears.
Absolutely. I mean, these objects connect us in a way that it's difficult to really achieve with almost anything else, isn't it? I mean, you described the pencil that you found and what was written with that pencil, and 100 years just passes in a blink, doesn't it?
Absolutely. The soldiers themselves are the important ones, and that we talked about taking relatives and how powerful that is, and of course that's what really counts. But these are tangible objects. The veterans are gone. The silent landscape of the cemeteries, the vast open skies of the Somme and the fields, but then you find a tangible object that somebody, a real person, a real soldier, held or wore, or it was affixed to his first field grave. Time disappears.
And occasionally, I mean, you find things that you can't take back. Wherever we go, we find munitions, of course, from the First World War. But some of this stuff ends up in local museums, or one particular museum at Pozieres.
Yeah, I found many rifles in my time, French Lebels, mainly British, and some German Mausers. Um, and it's funny, really. Sometimes, you find something and you take it away from its landscape or its environment, and it loses its connection, and that's distressing. So if I find something like that, I found a Luger pistol as well. I take them to the local museum, and they stay on the Somme. They stay as part of that history, that culture of the landscape or the culture of the First World War. It doesn't seem right to bring something like that back. But a smaller object sometimes, it keeps its connection for you. Again, difficult to explain, but and of course some stuff, as you and I both know, you mustn't touch the live munitions, the grenades, the shells. They're still as deadly today as they were when they were first made.
Absolutely. I mean, people tend to think that after a century they must all be safe, but we've both known people injured by these, and we've both read reports of people being killed mucking around with these things. So it's a serious thing. If you don't know what you're looking at, you shouldn't touch, should you?
Exactly, and some of them, particularly those that are on the sort of fuses that activate by percussion or contact. It's only a minor layer of surface corrosion. Underneath that, all the brass, the springs, there's brand new, as good as they were made 100 years ago.
And none of these objects, we don't ever really own them, do we? We're just custodians of them, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Whether you're a collector or anything, you are but a custodian, and that's why, as I say, that fragment going to Canada, absolutely the right thing. It's not mine, but if I'd left it in the field, it would never be going back to its family, and that is an extremely important aspect of these finds.
And I mean, that'll be something such immense for them. What it'll mean to them to have something like that that's stood on that grave. and it's from that period. It's the power of it, isn't it?
Oh, I can't tell you the how excited, happy, emotional the email I got back when I said, "Guess what? I've got your relative's fragment." And then, of course, for me, the bonus is that he sent me some photographs of a war memorial in Canada. I think it was possibly somewhere near Halifax. I can't remember exactly where. And to see that soldier's name and number, again, it's another connection. I'll never get to that war memorial, but I found a small piece of metal and linked all across the ocean by a picture to his name on a war memorial in Canada.
And the weather on the Somme, when you walk the battlefields in all weathers, I think it gives you a different perspective on it, doesn't it? Do you think?
Just a bit. The Somme, you can have 4 seasons in an hour. I've set off in beautiful blue skies, and then you see a dark cloud to the north. Great for photography, the atmosphere. And then you get a downpour, then horizontal sleet and snow. And then 10 minutes later, the sunshine comes back. And it's grim in March and February. It can be grim any time of the year if the weather's against you. But at least we know that at the end of the day, we take off our super waterproofs, our Berghaus kit or whatever it is, and you dry out, you go and have a beer and a nice meal. But those guys had to endure it for days on end in atrocious conditions. If it's scorching hot, incredibly thirsty, the old woolen uniforms uncomfortable. And of course, once they get wet, they'll never dry out until, and these guys were days and weeks. The Germans, their rotational system meant sometimes they spent far longer in the trenches in the frontline positions than the British troops.
It really makes you think, doesn't it? I mean, I remember that time when we walked up in the snow around Courcelette and Regina Trench. You think of what it must have been like to have been in forward positions in that sort of weather. It's just staggering, really. It's a testimony to how tough these guys were.
Well, yeah. And also, I guess in a way, that blanket of snow probably was a blessing for a short while, the freezing cold temperatures. But, we know snow dampens sounds and covers some of the atrocious sights in the shell holes and in the trenches. I suppose they saw a moment of beauty in it, but freezing cold, ice cold feet, and you're there all night the next day. Then it turns to that grey, horrible, murky, damp, raw cold that penetrates you. And these guys were in it for days on end.
Absolutely. I mean, even in modern boots, when your feet get damp, eventually they do one way or another. It makes you really understand, I think, just the problems of living in landscapes like that, and how trench foot must have been such an issue for these men.
Yeah, and of course, it was leather. They put whatever they put on to try and keep the water out. But no matter how hard you try, and no matter how much whale oil you rub into your feet, and your officer doing your foot inspections in those awful conditions, so many soldiers invalided out through trench foot. I've got a set of medals to a guy in the Worcester Regiment. He had a very short war. I think the first sort of winter of 14-15, by the spring, one of his feet got severe frostbite or trench foot, and that was the end of his war.
Yeah, terrible conditions in the front line. Now, I know that you walk quite a lot of the more familiar areas of the Somme, but you like to get off the beaten track into some of the lesser known ones, and you've developed that sort of favourite area, I'd call it, along the La Transloy Ridge between Gerdecourt and Morval, where you've done a few walks in recent years. Tell us a bit about that area.
Yeah, it's as integral to the Battle of the Somme as the 1st of July. It's where the fighting ground to a halt towards the end of September into October, November. Troops described the conditions as worse than the mud at Ypres. Soldiers who had fought at Verdun, the German soldier, described the artillery barrages as worse than at Verdun. There are no cemeteries up there. There are no memorials. There's nothing in the landscape to give you direction, really, and that's where trench maps or the linesman system really comes into its own. But yeah, the desperate fighting, where the Somme battle really ground to a halt in atrocious conditions, and of course the winter of 16-17, the coldest on record. Very few people go to that part of the battlefield. As I say, that the cemeteries are few and far between. There's no memorials. and it's high ground. And if the weather's against you, boy, it's grim. There is no shelter from the wind. It just cuts into you. But again, fascinating landscapes, and silent witnesses of the war can be found there.
And horrendous casualties in that part of the battlefield as well. Some of those attacks, like on the 7th of October when the 12th Eastern Division went in, just staggering levels of casualties.
Absolutely. As you say, the 7th of October, the big attempt to take that ridge, incredible. And it's so open, there is no cover. So once you've left your trench there isn't even like sort of the little banks that you can shelter in. You're out into the open, and the German trenches were always on the slightly higher ground, and then they had the positions on the reverse slopes. And you talked about the 12th Eastern Division. Well, around Guidecourt over the years, Royal Fusilier shoulder title, West Kent's shoulder title, Anna Buff's, all linked to that attack, the 7th of October 1916. And, you do your research, that they're the only battalions there of those particular regiments, and it's right where the attack went in. So being able to connect to a particular action that you've read about in the books as well, incredible.
Yeah, I think that's the beauty of what you do. It's field archaeology, and that what you're finding, these aren't just random objects, although they're actually telling part of the story of the Somme.
Yeah, they are. They're the last things really. The soldiers have gone. You've got the memorials in the cemeteries, and of course the relatives, as we already talked about. But these items are the last real tangible reminders. Powerful things, as I keep saying. But don't get me wrong, I don't go digging. They're just on the surface of a ploughed field. Usually they come to light after bad weather, because the brass in the shoulder title is bright green and you can't miss it. But I always say these items find you, not the other way around. You can be walking side by side with somebody and they'll walk past it, and it's as bright and as distinctive on the furrow to them as it is to you, but it somehow indicates to you it wants to be found.
Yeah, I think we've discussed this before, but things sometimes want to come out of the past, don't they? And they really do find you. You just don't find them.
I think so. I've had too many coincidences, too many, strange things that have happened that you can't put it into words, Paul. You really can't. It's just something that happens. I don't know. It's very difficult to verbalise it.
Well, when I look back in the early days of the Western Front Association, I think of people like John Dray and Tony Spagnoli and John Giles, and they used to sort of say the Great War was like a wavelength, and you're either tuned to it or you weren't. And I think that, whether you've been to the battlefields once or hundreds of times, I think that if you've got that connection, these things will mean something to you.
I think so. And, just to sort of expand on that, I mean, I have a general interest in the Second World War and indeed in a number of other conflicts, but it's not the same. I don't feel as connected. I don't feel as linked. They don't talk to me in the same way. So whether it's a particular wavelength that is being sent out from the First World War battlefields that I just attune to, but I don't have that connection to other conflicts, and it's strange.
It's interesting what you were saying earlier about the landscape around Guerdecourt, no cemeteries there, and that's why probably people don't go there. It's interesting how people visit battlefields, isn't it? It's things like that that bring them to a location, but it means in areas where there aren't cemeteries or memorials, somehow those places get forgotten.
Well, yeah, I mean, you can look at the Somme. Everybody sort of quite understandably will go to some of the key positions. The 1st of July, the Lochnagar crater, the sunken lane at Beaumont Hamel, the Tietval Memorial, of course, and the vast cemetery at Serres. And of course, some of those locations are on positions that were fought over through most of the Somme battle in one way or another. But you go to some of the places where equally important, and it didn't happen. But it's not just the Somme. You look at the visitors of the Somme, the visitors of the battlefields of Arras or French Flanders. So it's strange. Certain places do draw people, And I think you've either got to sort of really want to understand the conflict, the battle in its entirety, or you have a direct link as a family member that you know that, for example, one of your relatives was in the Liverpool PALS 30th Division fighting up on the Transloy Ridge. Otherwise, you don't go there. People don't go there.
And I suppose it means that we're sort of duty bound, I think, to highlight these places and raise people's awareness of that, which brings me on to sort of a final point, really, that, you know, here we are a few years now after the end of the Great War centenary. Is the Great War still relevant?
Absolutely. Is it relevant to how we view today's society? Is it relevant to how we consider the world changing? Well, I don't know. Some of those questions are really difficult to answer. But for me, the relevance is that ripple of time. People have still got the connection now, or if they don't realise it, the ripple will contact them, and they'll go back. More and more people are now researching their family and finding out these stories. And I think that's the relevance of it, because you must never forget the sacrifices of the generation of 1418, whether they died on the battlefields, whether they came back, whether they were severely wounded or traumatized mentally or physically. And of course, the forgotten victims, the children that grew up without their father, the women that never had a husband or a sweetheart to come back. The world changed, and it's never been the same again. And we have to listen to those lessons of the past, because if we don't, we'll lose touch, and that's a betrayal of the men of 1418. Well, the generation of 1418, not the men, because it affected everybody.
I think you're right, and I think what you described there is at the heart of this fascination, which is the stories of people, ordinary people in these extraordinary circumstances, and that's what I think attracts people, if that's the right word, to the story of the Great War. These ordinary men and women.
Ordinary men and women, Paul, absolutely. They weren't all heroes. There were some good guys, some bad guys. There were some jokers and comedians, some very serious people. Every sort of type of person on the spectrum of human society formed part of the 1418 generation, and their stories, their humanity, their lives, that's what counts. That's the important aspect to it all.
Absolutely. That's fantastic, Tim. So thanks for joining us on the Old Front Line. And here's the time where we can both get across there and record something on the spot.
Oh, my pleasure. That would be something to look forward to.
Cheers, Tim. Thank you.
Thank you.
Do give Tim a follow. You'll find him on Twitter at Trench Trotter. I'll put a link to that on the podcast website. I'll also put up some of the photographs of Tim's objects that he's found while walking the Somme battlefields, so you can see what we were talking about during the course of that chat. Hope you've enjoyed the first Trench Chat. Next week we return to a walk on the battlefields, and we're back in Flanders. You've been listening to an episode of The Old Front Line with me, military historian Paul Reed. Do take time to subscribe via Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or other podcast services. Tell us what you think using the hashtag OldFrontLine. Follow me on Twitter at Somcore, and have a look at the podcast website www.oldfrontline.co.uk. I'll see you next week on the battlefields of the Great War.